Hello everyone, welcome to another Hardcore Bob plugin tutorial. Today we'll be talking about compression. Now to demonstrate compression, I'll be using a plugin called FabFilter Pro C2. But what we'll be talking about today will apply to any compressor ever. Now before we get going here, I'd like to introduce the song today. The song is called Die For You by the very famous Blartha Stewart. And though the song title is a bit of an extreme one, such is the nature of love. Let's give it a listen.
Don't go it alone like a drop in the ocean. I'm standing beside you wherever you're going.
Sounds like it needs a lot of compression. So here we've got FabFilter Pro C2. Now for the time being, we're just going to focus on these little pluckers here. Now, before we start talking about these fancy circles all over the place, I want to talk about compression in general. A lot of people like to think of compression as just squashing something. So the loud things get quieter and the quieter things get louder. But I think that's a bit of an oversimplification. While compression can certainly be used for that, I like to think of compression as shaping a sound. What do I mean by that? So to demonstrate this, I'm going to pull up this little plugin called Volume Shaper. This is a great little plugin to show you the literal shape of a sound. Now some of you may have heard the term envelope, which, well, frankly, I'm not sure why it's called envelope. I think envelopes are something else entirely. But most shapes or envelope involve four main things. Attack, which is the beginning of a sound. Then you have something called decay. And you might think of decay as, well, not unlike decaying teeth or decaying anything. After that initial burst of attack, there's usually a bit of a dip in volume to whatever the general sound is. So if we're talking about a trumpet, there's usually there's an initial burst, the attack, and then a quick dip in volume. That's the decay right there, which leads us to sustain. The sustain is usually the length of the sound. What is the main chunk of the sound? And finally, we have this line down here, release. And that's just what you think it is. How long does it take the sound to go away? Now, all you need to do, folks, is look at any waveform and you can see the shape. And you can even start to train yourself to hear in shapes. So let's look at this waveform right here. I can tell it's a vocal because it says the word vocal right there on the track. Right here is probably the plosive of a consonant. Then we have a rather slow attack, which means it's a bit more rounded off. It's not a harsh, immediate attack like you might find on a synth, say. Then we have the other side of this little mountain here, which is the decay. And you can see this length right here is a bit of a decaying sustain. This is the sustain, a rather phallic sound. And right around here, we're looking at the release, which is also quite gradual. Let's hear what just this word sounds like.
5, 5, 5.
You hear that? He's yelling out the word fire because he doesn't want to die. So let's try using Volume Shaper to manipulate the shape of this plucker, just to illustrate what I mean by shape. So let's, for example, make the attack of this sound very, very slow, almost to the point where you can't hear it. What does that sound like? You hear that? Normally has a much sharper attack. Okay, now in this shape, I've taken just the attack and then a decay all the way down to 0 so that the sustain is 0 volume. So now the sound, I've sucked all the sustain out of it. You hear that? Now this time we'll make a more normal shape. So we have an immediate attack, a long decay, a long sustain, and let's make the release nice and sharp, like he's falling off a cliff because he's going to die for her. You hear that release is so sharp that it's even making a pop or a click sound, which you can remedy by just making it a little bit rounder. Very good. Now that we have an idea of shape, let's talk about compression. Now you can essentially use a compressor to change the shape and manipulate the shape of sounds. In most compressors, you'll find at least these 4 words: threshold, ratio, attack, and release. Let's talk about threshold. Threshold is simply the volume at which you want the compressor to kick in and begin its gain reduction. Now, gain reduction is just a fancy word for volume lowering. So if I have my threshold set to negative 25 decibels, that means if my sound is quieter than negative 25 decibels, the compressor won't even see it. The moment my sound goes above negative 25 decibels, the compressor kicks on. So for example, if we look at this keyboard sound, so as you can see, the sound is coming in at around negative 20 decibels. Now, because I have my threshold set all the way to negative 10 decibels, my sound isn't loud enough to trigger the compressor to turn on. So for a sound like this, I need to bring the threshold down to at least negative 20. Now, how fast should it kick on? Should it kick on right away, or should it kick on a little bit slower? That is determined by the attack. So we have our point of entry, our volume of entry. We have our how fast do we want it to kick in, and how fast or slow do we want it to go away. Now all that's left is the ratio, which is basically how intense of compression do you want. 1:1 is almost no compression at all, and you can raise that intensity. So for example, in the case of 7:1, what does that mean? That means that for every 7 decibels of volume, there will only be 1 decibel which is kept. So by this ratio, 14 decibels would be reduced to 2 decibels, and so forth. And you can squash this bug all the way to, in some cases, infinity, which means all the compression in the known universe. Now, of course, when you compress things, you often will lose volume, and sometimes you'll have that nice squashed sound that you want, but you want to make up for that lost volume with something called makeup gain. And that's what this gain knob is here for, folks. And below this knob, we have the dry gain, which is basically like doing parallel compression. So you have a compressed signal and an uncompressed signal, and you can mix the two so it's not overly squashed or overly dynamic. Now folks, down here you'll see these different sliders. No one cares about those. But if you must know, the knee looks just like a knee, and you can see that by clicking the word knee right there. Now as you can see, this shape looks like a knee, and this essentially is a more granular way of setting the roundness of the compression. So if you have a hard knee or 0 decibels, the compression will sort of click on right away. And if you set the knee to a very soft knee, it sort of rounds out the entry of the compression. Now this range slider you won't find in too many compressors, but all that does, folks, is it limits the maximum amount of applied gain change. So while the ratio scales the dynamic behavior of the compressor, the range simply sets the amount of volume that it can reduce. Now down here you can turn on look ahead, which illuminates this slider right here. The look ahead basically tells the compressor to anticipate the sound that's coming. So it can anticipate a sound up to 20 milliseconds in advance. And over here we have hold, which is another fine-tuning slider. It's a bit tricky to hear what this one does, but it prolongs the amount of time that the peaks of the gain reduction sustain. That's a lot of words that I'm not really sure I even understand. Now another thing you can do with the compressor is sidechain. Now while there's a lot of fantastic plugins just for sidechain, let me show you how to do it with Pro C. Right here you'll see the word sidechain. Just click that and there you go. So here we have a guitar and a kick drum playing at the same time. Now to give that guitar a little bit of a pump and to let the kick really sit in the mix better, I might want to tell that guitar to get the hell out of the way while that kick drum is in there. So in this case, I have the compressor on the guitar track because that's the track that I want to get quieter. Now up here where it says sidechain is where I feed it the kick drum. So you go here and you find your kick sound, which I've already put here. And then down here, this is very important, you set it to external. So right here it says internal, you set it to external, which tells it that you want the external sound to take command of the compressor. So let's hear what that sounds like. And notice that until the kick comes in, the guitar remains unaffected. And And that, folks, is a general overview of how Pro C works and compression at large. Compression is a simply must-have tool to have in your tool belt, and that's why it's one of my top 5 plugins to use on everything. So let's go ahead and put Pro C on our master bus here. Okay. So now bring the threshold down a little bit. Let's bring it there. Oh, that lost a good amount of volume, so let's add some makeup gain. Okay.
When you are broken, and then I will guide you home and be your eyes when you don't see. And I would die for you over and over again every time.
Let's turn the attack all the way
I
down.
won't lie, 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 lie,
There.
lie, 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 lie. I'm terrified too. I would die for you every time.
So there it was, a little bit compressed. Now let's try it without the Pro C.
I would fight for you through the night, baby, through the night. And I would die for you.
And with.
I would die for you every time. I would.
So there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And in a way, you did get 2 plugins in one. The FabFilter Pro C, as well as Volume Shaper, which is one of my favorite plugins to put on everything as well. Now go on and make that beautiful music we love. And remember to start listening to sounds as shapes. And of course, always, always compress everything. Take care now.